Mother. It's a word that feels safe, soft, sacred. It's supposed to mean protection, warmth, unconditional love. But history holds darker stories. Stories of women who saw their children not as souls to nurture, but as obstacles to control, threats to power, or tools to be shaped and sacrificed. What happens when the very person meant to protect you becomes the one you must survive? Mother. The moment we hear that word, we think of love, of life being given. This bond imaginable between a woman and her child. We picture comfort, protection, a presence that stands between innocence and the cruelty of the world. But history is not built only on tenderness. It is also built on ambition, fear, obsession, and the intoxicating pull of power. And sometimes, even the most sacred bond was not strong enough to withstand those forces. Today, we step into the lives of royal mothers whose relationships with their children were anything but gentle. Some were strange, some were controlling, and some crossed a line that feels almost unthinkable. Let's begin with a story that feels unsettling rather than brutal. A decision so unusual that even people of the time whispered about it in letters and memoirs. In the glittering courts of France lived a queen who had fought hard for her position, endured political storms, and protected her dynasty with fierce determination. This was Anne of Austria. She had two sons. The eldest would become Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. He was raised in the image of masculine power, strength, authority, royal destiny. But her second son, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, was treated very differently. Anne made a calculated choice. She feared that a strong, ambitious younger brother might one day challenge the throne. So instead of preparing Philippe to compete, she reshaped him. From childhood, she dressed him in gowns long after other boys had changed into breeches. She called him "my little girl." Court ladies would gather around him, arranging his hair, fastening skirts, encouraging the illusion. Now, it's true that small boys were often dressed similarly at very young ages, but Philippe was not a toddler. He was well past the age when boys were expected to begin stepping into manhood. Contemporary observers noticed. They wrote about it. They described the deliberate nature of it. This was not fashion. This was strategy. Philippe grew up surrounded by femininity, encouraged to embrace it. As an adult, he married twice, fathered children, but maintained passionate relationships with men and continued his love of elaborate feminine dress. His identity became part of court culture, flamboyant and unmistakable. Was Anne a monster? Perhaps not in the most obvious sense. She had endured war, political instability, and constant threats to her son's throne. In her mind, she may have been protecting the dynasty, but she did so by shaping her child into something carefully designed, not for his happiness, but for political safety. And that is where the unease begins. Because when a mother sees her child first as a threat to be neutralized, something fundamental shifts. And Anne was not the only royal mother whose love came tangled with control. In England, another young princess was growing up inside walls that felt less like protection and more like imprisonment. Her name was Victoria. Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, known as the Duchess of Kent, was determined that her daughter would one day wear the British crown. But determination slowly turned into domination. The young Princess Victoria did not grow up with freedom. She grew up inside a system, a rigid, suffocating structure, later known as the Kensington system. Every hour of her day was monitored, every interaction controlled. She was rarely allowed to be alone. She could not walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand. She slept in the same bedroom as her mother until the day she became queen. Imagine being a child and never having a moment that truly belongs to you. The architect of this system was John Conroy, her mother's ambitious secretary, widely believed to be far more than just an employee. Together, he and the Duchess isolated Victoria from the rest of the royal family. They limited her friendships. They whispered that she was weak, incapable, unprepared, all while shaping her into someone who would depend entirely on them. Why? Because if King William IV had died before Victoria turned 18, her mother would have become regent. Power would not have rested in the hands of a teenage girl, but in the hands of the Duchess and, by extension, Conroy. It was a political chess game played through the life of a child. King William saw what was happening. He publicly declared that he would live until Victoria came of age. And astonishingly, he did, dying just 1 month after her 18th birthday. On the day she became queen, Victoria asked for two things: 1 hour alone, and for her bed to be moved out of her mother's room. That request speaks louder than any accusation ever could. Their relationship never fully healed, though Victoria later softened toward her mother, especially after having children of her own. She described her childhood as deeply unhappy, controlled, manipulated, lonely. But here is where the story becomes painfully ironic. Victoria, the girl who longed for freedom, did not grow into the warm, nurturing mother we might hope for. She had 9 children, and she did not enjoy motherhood. She hated pregnancy, describing it in crude, almost animalistic terms. She called babies frog-like. She saw children less as blessings feelings and more as unavoidable consequences of passion. As they grew older, she engaged with them primarily through discipline and criticism. Prince Albert himself once wrote to her that constant scolding does not build affection. Victoria played favorites. Her youngest daughter Beatrice was her emotional anchor. After Albert's death, Victoria expected Beatrice to remain unmarried forever, a permanent companion in mourning. When Beatrice dared to fall in love and become engaged, her mother refused to speak to her for months. Her eldest daughter's pregnancy was described as dreadful news. Princess Alice was mocked for breastfeeding, so much so that Victoria named a cow after her in bitter sarcasm. And then there was Bertie, her son, the future King Edward VII. Victoria blamed him for Albert's death, believing that stress caused by his behavior had weakened her husband's health. She wrote that she could never look at him without shuddering. Imagine carrying that weight, being seen not as a child who makes mistakes, but as the reason your father is gone. After Albert's death, Victoria wrapped herself in endless mourning. Black dresses, closed curtains, emotional distance. Her children became supporting characters in her grief, rather than individuals with lives of their own. Perhaps she was repeating what she had known, a childhood shaped by control, growing into motherhood shaped by emotional withdrawal. But history does not pause to analyze trauma. It simply records the impact, and sometimes the impact is devastating. If Victoria's story is one of emotional coldness and control, the next is darker still, a mother who rejected her daughter from the very first breath. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg did not greet her newborn with joy. When Queen Christina of Sweden was born, her mother reportedly cried out in disappointment. She had wanted a son. Instead, she saw what she described as an ugly child, dark, hairy, unwanted. Christina's early life was marked by strange accidents, a beam falling into her cradle, a fall down the stairs, a nurse accused of dropping her onto stone, leaving her shoulder permanently damaged. Were these accidents, or something more sinister? Whispers circulated, and while nothing can be proven, the pattern is chilling. When Christina's father died, her mother plunged into obsessive grief. She kept her daughter in black-draped rooms, candles burning day and night. Above their bed hung the preserved heart of Christina's father in a golden casket. The child was forced to sleep beside her weeping mother in near darkness for over a year. This was not comfort, it was confinement. Eventually, authorities removed Maria Eleonora's parental rights. Christina was raised by multiple caretakers, so she would not grow attached to any one of them. A childhood without stability, without warmth, without trust. And yet Christina would grow into one of the most unconventional monarchs in European history, refusing marriage, abdicating her throne, choosing intellectual and personal freedom over expectation. But if these stories disturb you, what comes next is something else entirely, because now we leave behind emotional cruelty and step into the realm of mothers who made a decision no parent should ever face. They chose power over their own children's lives. In the Ottoman Empire, survival at court was never guaranteed, not for rivals, not for brothers, and not even for sons. Kösem Sultan entered the imperial harem as a young concubine and rose higher than anyone could have predicted. She became the legal wife of Sultan Ahmed I. After his death, she stepped into a role unprecedented for a woman, regent for her young son, Murad IV. For the first time, a woman effectively ruled the empire during what would later be called the Sultanate of Women. Kösem was intelligent, calculating, politically gifted. She reformed policies, navigated factions, and protected the dynasty through years of instability. But power, once tasted, rarely releases its grip easily. When Murad grew older and began ruling independently, he followed Ottoman tradition and ordered the execution of potential rivals, including his own brothers. Only through Kösem's desperate intervention was one son, Ibrahim, spared. Ibrahim grew up in isolation, locked away for years in fear that he might be executed. That kind of confinement does not leave a mind untouched. When Murad died and Ibrahim was told he would become sultan, he reportedly refused to believe it until he saw his brother's lifeless body. Kösem hoped to guide him, to rule through him as she had before, but Ibrahim proved unstable, erratic, consumed by indulgence and paranoia. His behavior sparked unrest among the elite and the janissaries. Rumors of madness spread through the capital. As rebellion brewed, Ibrahim turned to the one person he believed would protect him, his mother. But Kösem made a choice. She agreed to his removal. She allowed the machinery of the state to move forward, and in 1648, Ibrahim was executed, strangled on imperial orders. Kösem, once again regent for her young grandson, witnessed the fall of her last surviving son. Was it necessity necessity, a desperate act to save the empire from collapse? Or was it the final proof that power had eclipsed motherhood entirely? 3 years later, Kosum herself would be strangled in a palace coup. In the Ottoman court, the wheel always turned. Yet even this story pales beside what happened centuries earlier in Byzantium. Irene of Athens became empress after the death of her husband, ruling as regent for her young son, Constantine VI. At first, it seemed conventional, a mother safeguarding the throne until her child came of age. But Irene did not intend to step aside. As Constantine grew older, she insisted on being addressed not merely as regent, but as co-ruler. Her name appeared before his on official decrees. Power was not something she was borrowing, it was something she claimed. When Constantine tried to assert independence, ordering the army to swear loyalty to him alone, Irene maneuvered quietly. The young emperor struggled with military failures and political mistakes. His support weakened, and Irene waited. In 797, her supporters seized Constantine. He was taken to the very chamber in the palace where he had been born. There, on his mother's orders, he was blinded. The brutal Byzantine method of rendering a ruler unfit to govern. Iron rods, no mercy. He died soon after. Irene became the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name. The church would later honor her for restoring religious icons, but history never forgets the price she paid for the throne. She had carried that boy within her. She had given him life, and then she had taken from him his sight, his crown, and ultimately his future. So what matters more, love or power? Each of these women answered that question differently. Some controlled, some manipulated, some emotionally scarred their children in ways that echoed for generations, and some crossed into something far darker. It's easy to judge them from centuries away, easy to call them monsters, but perhaps the more unsettling question is this: when power is absolute, when the survival of a dynasty hangs in the balance, when ambition and fear collide, how fragile does even the strongest bond become? History remembers queens and empresses. It records victories and reforms. But behind the gilded thrones were children, shaped, sacrificed, or shattered. And that is the part of the story that lingers long after the crowns have fallen.